Hi everyone, welcome to the Richards lecture from all of us here at 8 Notes. A very warm welcome. I hope you guys are all doing super well, enjoying your break and having a smashing start to the year. Let's get started and let's jump right into it. Lots to get through today. I hope Mod A went well for you. I know most schools tend to start with Mod A. If you are yet to do Mod A and that's why you're here, you're doing the Richards, welcome. Hopefully today will help you understand the comparative study between the two texts, and if you've already done it, hopefully today will help you consolidate your knowledge. So a quick bit about 8 Notes and what we do here at 8 Notes. So we have lots of different resources available for you here today that you can check out on our website, including a study notes, lectures that we have on this week, range of different lectures. So please attend all the ones that are relevant to you. There is no limit on how many you can attend, so try and get to as many as you can. In the lectures you'll find like the lecture slides and stuff, super helpful resources. And then we also have discussion forums, newsletters, articles with like study strategies and tips. So check all of it out, and you can do that at our website. So we also have, along with that, a range of paid resources, and that includes, and that's all found in our catalog at 8 Notes Plus. So 8 Notes Plus is basically like a catalog of all our online resources, including our topic tests, course notes summaries, text guides for English. So a lot of what I'm going through today with King Richard and Looking for Richard, a lot of that information has been consolidated from those text guides, and you'll find a whole heap more on there. And we also have text guides for like almost all the prescribed texts, if I may say so, from the syllabus. So definitely check it out. And we also now have new flashcards and stuff for like a lot of STEM subjects like bio and chem. So super helpful. And we have our own AI answer bot, which kind of acts as your tutor and helps answer your questions. So if you are interested in that, if you're looking for more resources, give it a look. I definitely think it'd be worth your while, having been a past user of what we had before this, which was Edit Limited. Having been a past user of the the text guides, the course booklets, the course summary notes and stuff, I think it's a wonderful resource. And again, I say that from experience, not just because I work here, but from experience. It's a really good source if you are looking for a bit of extra help. So, welcome to the lecture. We are looking at King Richard III by William Shakespeare and Looking for Richard by Al Pacino. And this is for our April lecture series. So, let's get started. Once again, welcome to the lecture. Today, I'll be going through the two texts, and in terms of housekeeping, just a quick bit about that. So you'll find the slides available in the resources section. The lecture is recorded, but I will be live to answer all your questions. If you have any questions, please ask via the chat box that is, or the live chat box that's available down the bottom. Sorry, just gonna check everything's working okay. Perfect. So a bit about myself. My name is Aditi. I graduated in 2021 as the Ducks with ATA of 95, and the subjects that I did well in were English Extension, Advanced, PDHP and Biology, and I'm currently over at the University of Sydney studying a Bachelor of Science and Bachelor of Advanced Studies in Medical Science. A big reader, avid reader, love sunny days, good shows, I guess that's a bit about me, other than my HSC journey. But yeah, if you have any questions about uni, about obviously any of the other subjects like PD, Bio, or English Extension, please feel free to ask in the chat box. So, what are we doing today? We're going to look through Richard III first, then we're going to look through Looking for Richard, and then we are going to look at the comparative study between the two and consider how the texts align, collide, and mirror each other. There is a bit to get through today, but I'm hoping that the slides will be helpful. I'm hoping that I will be helpful in helping you clear out any ideas that you have, or any questions that you have, or any doubts that you have for the two texts. So let's just begin firstly by looking at each text individually and looking at its features, looking at what you kind of need to know. So we'll begin with context for Richard III. So Richard III is Shakespeare's one of his history plays. It's a historical play. Richard III was an actual figure back in England in the late 1500s, and so it's based on a real life figure with the background of the medieval English history. However, the thing with Shakespeare is he writes historical plays, but he doesn't write them accurately. He writes inaccurate historical plays. And what does that mean? That means that, yep, his plays are not accurate, that they are dramatized. They're dramatized, and along with being dramatized, they're also manipulated to deliver his propaganda. And what's that propaganda? Let's have a look at that. So, the plays are dramatized to create interest and to appeal to the audience, and to the values of those audiences. So we know that the Elizabethan society at the time was very religious, theocratic society. They believed in all of these different doctrines of like great chain of beings. So there was a hierarchy in society, the divine right of kings, that the king was a representative of God, and hence he was second to nature. So the king's word is kind of like the God's word, and so these values were very important at the time for people. Those values were important for the monarchy at the time, and we know that Shakespeare was very closely affiliated to that monarchy. He was one of his patrons were Queen Elizabeth I herself. So by studying how Shakespeare has molded that historical event to suit his preferences, to suit his agenda at the time, we actually gain understanding into the prejudices that pervaded society at the time, and that pervaded the general public at the time. So the society and the audience influenced the text, just as the text influences the societies and the audiences to think or feel or a certain way. So why is it that Richard III is inaccurate? Why do we call it a work of propaganda? We will be talking about this, and this is a key idea here when you talk about authorial purpose for Shakespeare, but it's this notion that Shakespeare wrote Richard III during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, who was a Tudor monarch. She was a Tudor monarch, and she and her family came into power, the House of Tudor came into power when Elizabeth's grandfather, Henry VII, actually succeeded Richard III as the King of England after he defeated Richard in battle. So in the play, if you've had a look at the play or you've had a look at the summary, you would see a character named Richmond. Richmond defeats Richard at the end of the play. Richmond is Queen Elizabeth's grandfather, and so by showing that Richard was evil, Richard was conniving, he was villainous, he was a usurper, he was Machiavellian, Shakespeare's basically showing how Queen Elizabeth's grandfather, how Richmond at the time brought peace to England by killing Richard. Richard was a bad person, Richard was villainous and evil, and so by killing him, Elizabeth's grandfather brought peace to England, and now he's the rightful heir to the throne, and the Tudor monarchy are the rightful heirs to the throne. Like, they deserve the throne, they are the true rulers of England. And so he tries to legitimize that Tudor reign by promoting the Tudor myth, by showing that Elizabeth's forefathers as the rulers who brought prosperity to England after defeating Richard III. And so what this does is that this disseminates their propaganda. It shows people that Richard was a bad person, and Queen Elizabeth's forefathers were like gods, almost like coming and saving them, saving the nation. That's the vibe that this has. So that is all fine. That's what Shakespeare's showing, but why is it inaccurate? Because a lot of this is not proven by history. And there is a lot of biased agenda here. So Shakespeare, for example, physically describes Richard as grotesque. He has a deformed hunchback. But we've actually found out that recent forensic evidence has shown that Richard was actually not a hunchback. Now, why is this important? What difference does it make that Shakespeare's shown Richard as a deformed hunchback? Well, by showing that what Shakespeare does is that he follows or he adheres to the Levitical doctrine, and that's this idea that if you are unnatural in any way, if you look different, if you have any deformity, if there's something physically wrong with you, that is a sign of the fact that there is something like that is a sign of the fact that you are evil by nature. That nature has basically made you deformed, or it's made you deformed, or it's given you a physical ailment because you are evil. And that's what Shakespeare's showing, right? If you have a look at the play, the first soliloquy is that when he says, "I'm determined to prove a villain," like I cannot prove a lover, therefore I'm determined to prove a villain. He says that I am unfinished, sent before my time, damned by nature, whatever. That's what Richard says in his own soliloquy. So what Shakespeare does is, from the very beginning of the play, he establishes this fact that Richard is actually, he's a bad person. He is evil by nature, and his deformity is a symbol of that. So that is basically showing that from the very beginning, Shakespeare wanted to turn his audiences against Richard. Like, he doesn't want, like, he antagonizes him, you know, creates him that anti-hero from the very beginning, so that the audience never empathizes with him. And we see that throughout the play, every time Richard is planning something evil, he has a soliloquy where he reveals his intentions, so that people don't fall for it, because he has that duplicity where he then starts to act nice, and he's understanding or whatever, and Shakespeare doesn't want people to fall for the act, so he tells them beforehand through Richard's soliloquy that this dude is bad news. And that's agenda. That's serving his agenda, to turn people against Richard from the very beginning. And one of the ways through which he does that is by showing him as deformed, to adhere to that Levitical doctrine, that he's evil by nature, that he's a bad person just because of that ailment. And now we know that historically that's not true, because Richard wasn't a hunchback, actually. And there are so many crimes attributed to Richard within the play, and it is now actually accepted that Richard was pretty innocent for most of them, while others cannot actually be proven. So some of the myths, like Richard was a hunchback with a withered arm, Richard murdered Edward, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, so his elder brother. Richard murdered the Edward, Anne's husband. Richard murdered the deposed King Henry the Sixth. Richard contrived the execution of his brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Again, the first soliloquy is about George, Duke of Clarence. Like, it's not about George, but it's about, like, his plans to get George killed so that he gets a step closer to the throne. Now we know that he didn't even do that. Richard forced Anne Neville's marriage Richard forced Anne Neville into marriage and poisoned her. We know that's not true. Again, the play shows that. They show how Richard manipulates and rues Anne. Richard, just without cause, usurped the throne from his nephew, Edward V, and Richard was a cruel tyrant. All of those are myths. So there you are. All of those are myths. So now, having that in mind, we now need to consider why Shakespeare has done that. And that's one of the things you want to bring out in your essay, and you want to talk about, is why has Shakespeare done that, and how does that compare to Pacino's authorial purpose. Another piece of context that you'll need to know is the War of the Roses. So the War of the Roses occurred between 1455 and 1485, so pretty long, right, 32 years. And it is the popular name which is given to a civil conflict between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Both the House of Lancaster and the House of York come from the same family. Like, it's called a Plantagenet, so you might have seen in the play where Richard is referred to as a proud Plantagenet. So that's just a house, but then the house has two rival branches, Lancastrian and York. And so they have been fighting internally for the control of the English throne. so what Richard III does is that so Richard III takes place during this time, towards the end of the war, towards the last stages of the war. Other Shakespearean plays, like for example King Henry IV Part 1, that actually also links back to all of this, but that happens way earlier on. So if you're studying King Henry IV Part 1 for Module B, you'll find a bit of similarities or a bit of contextual Easter eggs surrounding like the early stages of the war. But Richard III itself takes place during the last stages of the war, so just before the end of the war. And the House of Lancaster is represented by a red rose. House of York is white rose. So we see in the play, for example, in the soliloquy, in Richard's soliloquy, the first line is oh god, I just forgot the first line. There's like the son of York, right? So now is the winter of a discontent made glorious summer by the son of York. That's what studying Richard does to you. You remember it 3 years later on as well. But yeah, so that's when the son of York is referring to his oldest brother Edward, who's now the king, the son of York. So you don't have to know every single detail about the war. You don't have to know how it started, when it started, where it started. If you wanted to, you could, but you don't have to. Not for the modulate anyway. Though some things might be easy to brush upon might just be the aftermath. So what happens afterwards. Origins, if you want to. The players in the conflict. So who's a Lancastrian, who's a York. That's an important one because we do see there are so many characters in the play. It can get pretty confusing pretty easily because all of their names are pretty similar. There are like 2 Edwards in there. One is the King Edward from the Lancastrian side who is killed. No, one is the son of Henry Edward who is killed by Richard. The other Edward is Richard's brother. So like just know the difference. And the events that transpired. Like it's when you talk about context in your essay, you obviously don't want to spend time talking about context on its own, right? So you're not actually sitting there writing about the War of the Roses and what happened. You just integrate that context into your analysis. So that's why you don't have to know an awful lot. You just have to know enough so that you can easily integrate it and or cohesively integrate it into your essay. It makes your study of character motivations and play easier, and it allows you to discern between fact and fiction that Shakespeare has created. So here we are. Here's the context. Now this is a very I was going to say concise, but it's not too concise. But this is a summary of what actually happened in Richard III. Okay, so it kind of links back to the War of the Roses, but it's just a plot summary of what happened in Richard III. So conflicting. So it links back to the War of the Roses. Sorry, but this is a summary of what is shown in the play versus what actually happened in real life. My bad. So let's have a look. Conflicting claims for the throne occurred after King Edward III's death. So that was between Yorks and Lancasters. They originated from the same family, the Plantagenets. But Lancasters managed to have a throne. You don't have to know that. Right, so what just happens is that King Henry VI, a Lancaster who was persuaded to marry Margaret of Anjou as a political maneuver to gain French support. However, what corrupt rule from Margaret and her allies leads to discontentment among people. That increases the popularity of Henry's cousin, who's the Richard of York. So that's not our Richard. I think that's the first Richard, and then there's Richard II, and then Richard III. So a civil war broke out until there was a Yorkist victory where Edward IV, Richard of York's son, was crowned king. But then what Edward IV did was he made a political mistake because he backed out of a marriage with a French princess, and instead he married a widow and a Lancastrian supporter, Elizabeth Woodville. Those characters we see in the play because there's Edward IV, who's the king, and his wife Elizabeth Woodville, Queen Elizabeth in the play. And so this move was unpopular amongst his followers. It alienated his chief supporter and advisor, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick allied with the Warwick then allied with the Lancasters, and he turned Edward's younger brother George Duke of Clarence against him. So this is obviously not shown in the play, but we see George, Duke of Clarence. The efforts briefly restored the previous King Henry VI, but then Edward IV managed to recapture the throne. Henry VI died in captivity, and his son Edward of Westminster was killed in battle. In the play, we see Henry VI corpse make an appearance, and Henry of Westminster is mentioned. And Anne Neville in the play also appears, who is Edward's wife. And Henry IV's wife, Margaret of Anjou, right there, also appears. But that's historically incorrect because she wouldn't be around at the time. But she, obviously, Margaret in the play is the one who sees through Richard's facade, and she curses him. She has prophecies. So she's a big part of the play. So, for example, here we know that historically George turned against the king. That's why George was not, he was out of the way of the throne. But obviously, and Henry was killed in imprisonment. Richard didn't kill him, and so that is inaccurately portrayed in the play as both of Richard's deeds. Rest of Edward IV's reign was peaceful, but conflict resumed after his death. This is where events of the play begin. Although Edward V, who was Edward IV's son, 12-year-old he was, and he was in line to succeed him as king, Edward's younger brother Richard declared that Edward's children were illegitimate, and that was due to Edward's secret and invalid, because I think she was a widow at the time, so it was considered invalid marriage to Elizabeth, and that made Edward V unable to inherit the throne, and that's when Richard took the throne. And so what Richard did is that then he became Richard III, but his reign was cut short by Henry Tudor, who was a descendant of the Lancastrians, and he had royal support, and he had raised an army in France, and he'd crossed the English Channel, defeated Richard in the Battle of Bosworth Field, and then he became King Henry VII, and he married Edward IV's daughter, Princess of York, Elizabeth of York, and then that way he united the Lancastrians and the Yorks to become the Tudor family, and then after that, 2 generations later, Queen Elizabeth I, Henry VII's granddaughter, takes the throne, and that's where Richard writes this play about Richard. So Shakespeare writes this play about Richard. Okay, so here you go. Here is a summary of, or I guess like not a summary, but also like a line of a family tree of what's happening. So House of Lancaster, we have Queen Margaret and King Henry IV. Margaret's a widow. They have a son, Edward of Westminster. Lady Anne marries him, but then after he dies, she marries Richard. Richard in the play kills his brother Clarence, Duke of Clarence, so George. King Edward dies of illness. All three are sons of Richard and Cecily Neville, who was the Duchess of York, and Richard, I think that's Richard II. And then that's them. Richard also kills, along with Clarence, he also kills Edward V, so King Edward's son. He also kills another Richard, who is, I guess, the second prince, whose name was Richard, and Elizabeth of York he doesn't kill. She marries Richmond, and then they have a son, Edward VIII, and then Edward VIII is not in the play, but then Edward has, Henry VIII, so they have a son, Henry VIII, and then Henry VIII's daughter is Queen Elizabeth I. And on the Woodville side of the family, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, Lady Grey, was first married to John Grey, and they had 2 kids, Thomas and Richard. And you would have seen these two in so Dorset and Grey, they're referred to as, so that's their titles, and you would see them in the soliloquies when like they're always with Elizabeth, and then they're also, I don't think they're killed, but something happens to them as well. Richard also manages to deal with those two. So, war has ended. After Richard III, Tudor dynasty began, and Tudor rose is a combination of the Lancastrian and the York roses. Remember that Queen Elizabeth I, Shakespeare's monarch, was a member of the House of Tudor. She was the granddaughter of Henry VII, daughter of Henry VIII, and so Pacino paints them in a good light. So, let's briefly talk about the Elizabethan era. It was considered to be the golden age of England. At the time, Elizabeth was considered responsible for the peace and their growing wealth as a nation, despite their domestic and foreign challenges. There was a lot of conquests at the time. They were expanding. They were, visiting other nations, conquering other nations, and it was just considered a good time for them. Art was blossoming. Obviously, we had Shakespeare. We also had other writers and artists at the time, and so there was the arts were flourishing, including poetry, music, literature, and theatre. So in terms of context, this is what we need to focus on, right? You don't have to focus on this stuff. Like, you wouldn't write in your essays that everyone was prospering at the time, it was a great time. What you want to focus on is how are those contextual values of the Elizabethan era, how are they actually reflected in Richard III? So, here we have firstly the Tudor myth. So the Tudor myth is what Shakespeare legitimizes Elizabeth's reign by villainizing Richard, right? So and this is what we've just talked about, by showing Richard as the bad guy and Henry VII as the rightful heir to the throne, the person who who freed England from Richard's reign, who was the bringer of peace and prosperity to England. That guy is Queen Elizabeth's grandfather, and so that's how the play paints them, and hence why there are lots of historical inaccuracies here. In terms of politics and religion, there's a lot of inclusion of religious imagery and aphorisms which reflect the theocracy of Elizabethan England. The play is very politically correct. Again, it focuses on placing Elizabeth in a good light, her family in a good light, so it's very politically correct. And within the play, you would find that there were so many religious imagery and aphorisms that reflected Henry VII in a good light. So a good example of that is towards the end, when just before the Battle of Bosworth Field, when Richard dreams of the ghosts of the people he's killed, and one of them is Buckingham, and Buckingham says, "God and good angels fight on Richmond's side." Richard falls in the height of his own pride. I think that's the quote, pretty sure, word by word. But that is when you see again how they paint Richard as like he's evil by nature. God doesn't want him to be the king. He doesn't deserve to be the king. He is not the right heir to the throne. Like, nature is against him, whereas nature supports Richmond, God supports Richmond, and therefore Richmond is the rightful heir to the throne. And again, to the audience, that is basically signaling that the guy you need to support is Richmond. Don't worry about Richard. And so it uses a lot of religious imagery to again portray Richmond and the Tudors in the Lancasters in a way, in a really good light. And then one thing you have to consider is the role of theatre, right? And this is where we start to get a bit metatextual, and this is where you could then compare a lot of this to Looking for Richard. So at the time, play scripts were censored, so even if Shakespeare wanted to, he wouldn't have been able to write much bad stuff about, Elizabeth's family anyway. Not that he would want to, because she was his patron. She was funding him. He had the Globe Theatre for his plays. He was really popular at the time. He wouldn't go out and write bad stuff about her anyway. I guess towards the last play that Shakespeare wrote, The Tempest, that one's an interesting one because it kind of goes into a more Renaissance humanism direction, whereas this play's more determinist. It's saying that, it's basically saying that don't try to fight fate. Like, Richard tries to take fate in his own hand. Richard tries to write his own destiny. It doesn't turn well for him, doesn't turn out well for him. That's what Shakespeare is warning against. Whereas he kind of starts to waver on those ideas a bit in Tempest, which was his last play. Elizabeth was dead by then. King Jacob, like, it was a Jacobean era at the time, so I think he probably had a bit more leeway then, and it was his last play, so I think he was pretty he took a bit of creative liberty. But obviously with this play, he's a very staunch advocate of determinism. And there was, in terms of the Royal Theatre specifically, coming back to my point, Queen Elizabeth's Men, that was a troupe of actors formed by Elizabeth's spymaster to spread Protestant and royalist propaganda. White theatre. So theatre was a play to it wasn't just entertainment, right? They're not just entertaining anyone, they're actually trying to spread propaganda. That's what they're trying to do. And this is where you want to think about, what is Pacino trying to do through his work? What are his intentions? And they were also tasked with espionage activities at the time, so it wasn't all fun and games. Cool, but obviously you wouldn't write that in your essay. You don't want to talk about the Royal Theatre. You don't want to talk about what Shakespeare is trying to the propaganda he's trying to disseminate. So now let's talk about another key contextual idea, which I've kind of referred to already. Divine right of kings. Divine right of kings, or God's mandate, is a political and a religious doctrine of royal legitimacy. This is basically saying that the king is appointed by nature, that the king is the representative of God, and if you go against the king, you're going against God, and that's going to have consequences. That's what he shows through a lot of his plays. Think Macbeth, right? With Macbeth, that's the biggest thing. Macbeth kills King Duncan, he goes against that, he takes destiny into his own hands, and that's Shakespeare saying bad stuff's gonna happen. That's exactly Richard. Richard wants to be king, he's determined to prove a villain, he's going to get to the throne in one way or another, and that's basically seen here. So it's a political and a religious doctrine of royal legitimacy. And that quote from earlier, that God and good angels fight on Richmond's side, and Richard falls in height of all his pride. And you can see how that juxtaposes Richmond to Richard. So Richmond is supported by God, good angels, he's supported by nature, he is validated by nature, and this is a ghost saying, so it's kind of like Buckingham, he's kind of like all-knowing at this point, whereas Richard will fall in the height of his own pride. And that idea of pride again links back to that humanist thing where Richard's like, I'm gonna do this, I can do this, and that's his pride. And that's juxtaposing Richard's pride to Richmond's I guess humility, and humility in the sense that he's fighting for his country, he's assembling an army, he wants to bring peace back to England. So Shakespeare does this too, and he doesn't only do it in this quote, you see this throughout the play. So, this basically asserts that kings derive their authority to rule from the will of God. Any attempt to depose, dethrone, or limit a king's power opposes such will and is a sacrilegious act. Only God could deal with an unjust king. That's what they're saying. And so any individual who usurps the throne would be acting against this divine right. And that's why it says God fights on Richmond's side, because Richmond is there to defeat Richard. So God fights on his side. And in the play, Shakespeare reflects this concept as Richard is depicted as a sinful usurper who has wrongfully seized power against God's will. So this is where we start to look at this big idea of determinism versus humanism. This is the idea you want to focus on in your essays. So essentially with determination, it's this notion that all events, including human action and decision, they're all determined by causes external to the world, that we don't decide, it's all written in the stars, right? Like Romeo and Juliet, it's written in the stars, there's star-crossed lovers, but yeah, it's all written in the stars, so we don't have any say over it. That's what this is saying. This links back to this providentialism, this idea that all events on earth, they're all controlled by God. So that's this determinism view. Whereas humanism is the stance that emphasizes on the values of the human being, that, you know, human beings have the free will to determine their own fate, right? So it's this, basically this determinism versus humanism idea can also be looked at as free will versus fate. You know, do we have a fate, a predestined fate, or are we able to chart our own course? It emphasizes mankind's own capacity for self-determination. So that's the key here. Now, Shakespeare's time did reflect a more secular fascination with free will. It was there at the time, but humanism was still viewed as dangerous. It wasn't like encouraged by society. It was viewed as dangerous. Viewed as dangerous because it freed men from the religious boundaries and from the religious doctrines and the divine order that's set in place to have order in society. So that's a very important concept that you want to think about, and that really gives a rational explanation for what is actually happening, for what is Richard actually trying to do. So, here we are now. The great chain of beings is another key idea. So, the Elizabethans believed that God set out a natural order, right? There was a natural order beginning with, there was a natural hierarchy. At the top of that hierarchy was God, just below God was the king. And this great chain of being, this idea was that, this hierarchy was prescribed for all matter in life, and the thought was that everyone should be satisfied to stay on the level which they are, because that's the level they've been given by God, so they shouldn't try and go against that. And that's exactly opposite of what Richard does, right? Richard goes against it. Richard goes, I don't want to just be no duke, I want to be king, I'm going to be king, full stop. And so he tries to go against that. And so any challenge to status quo would be met with divine retribution. That's the idea surrounding great chain of beings, and that's what Shakespeare shows, that when Richard decides to go against it and to chart his own course, he will face the repercussions. He will be defeated. And that's why the whole last scene, you know, for Shakespeare's work, it's basically a celebration of Richard's death, right? It's basically Richard Shakespeare going that this guy deserved to die, because of the fact that he has taken so many innocent lives, he's killed so many people, he's a villainous Machiavellian usurper, and he's wrong, and Richmond is right. Richmond is the hero, this guy is the villain, he's the anti-hero. So that's what we see in the play. Now, so that's context. The reason I've spent so much time on context is because you need it in your essays. And this is where the comparative study, remember, the comparative study is not just you studying the two texts and saying, okay, these are the similarities, these are the differences, but it's actually you then going, this is why these exist. This is why these things between Pacino and Shakespeare are similar, and this is why these things between Pacino and Shakespeare are different. They exist because of the different context, because of the different values, because Shakespeare's theocratic, Elizabethan, determinist society is very different, function very differently to Pacino's postmodern American society. And so the way in which the ideas are exchanged across time differ. So power is still a universal idea. Manipulation is still a universal idea. Ambition is still a universal idea. But the way in which it differs across those two time periods is very different. So let's firstly, before we go on forward with looking for Richard, let's just talk about some recurring motifs and themes. So the first one is prophecy, dreams, and omens. So Elizabethans believed that dreams had connections to future, and that dreams could be prophetic at times. That's why Dreams are used and omens are used in Margaret's prophecies, for example. They are used as fatalistic, they're used to reinforce the fatalistic and the determinist play of the nature, that everything happens for a reason. That's why the night before the battle, Richard sees the ghost. He sees the ghost, he has the dream of the ghost, and the ghosts tell him that he's not winning, right? And so that's basically reinforcing the determinist nature of the play. And there are many prophecies, many omens throughout the play. Think about Margaret's prophecies, Margaret's curses. All of those are really important because Margaret's basically saying, you're going to get this back, right? She's saying to Richard that you will fall. You're not getting away with any of this. So think about some other prophecies. The G prophecies. I think this one's probably my favorite one. So G of Edwards and the killer shall be, right? And everyone think it's George, Duke of Clarence. And the irony here is that it's not George, Duke of Clarence, and I think this is a point that's sometimes missed. It's ironic because it's not George, Duke of Clarence, it is Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The G is referring to Gloucester, not George, because at the times they were known by their like the specific place in front of like the title. That's what they were known as. They were not known as George. He was known as Clarence. You see it in the play. He's referred to as Clarence. The same way Richard would not be known as Richard. He would be referred to as Gloucester. And ironically, though, everyone thought it was George, Duke of Clarence, and not Richard, Duke of Gloucester. So that's the G prophecy. And what I love about that prophecy is that, or what I really like that you can pick upon in this comparative study, is how Pacino changes it. Because Pacino knows the American audience is not going to sit there and pay attention to George, Duke of Clarence, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, because that's just too many words, right? So what he does is he goes, okay, we're going to change to C. C of Edward's heir, the killer shall be. And it's, again, it takes so much meaning away from the real work. It takes so much meaning away, because what Shakespeare was trying to show all along, ironically, dramatic irony, was that it was G, Gloucester. But Pacino changes that because he's like, let's just simplify this for the audience. He's like, C of Edward's heir, the killer shall be, and C is referring directly to Clarence. So he kind of misses that in a way. And I just think it's a really cool point of comparison between the two texts. Then Margaret's curse and prophecy. She curses everyone, and she is and her prophecies are obviously quite impactful in the play. Stanley's prophetic dream, Henry the Sixth prophecy of Richmond becoming king. That's an important one. That's foreshadowing what's going to happen. And then Richard and Richmond's dream of the ghost. I think that is again one of the most powerful ones. It's a powerful one, and it's an important one because you can always link back to this and talk about, and this is a good example to use when you're talking about determinism versus humanism versus so fate versus free will. So now let's talk about women as voices of reason. So with both Shakespeare and Richard, they're both like, sorry, not with Richard, but with both Shakespeare and Pacino, to a huge extent, women in both are marginalized. But with Shakespeare though, he does like, obviously they're still marginalized by the patriarchal nature of the society. However, Shakespeare still empowers women by making them the voice of the reason in this play. Margaret knows. The Duchess of York knows that Richard, her son, is not a good person. Queen Elizabeth figures it out pretty early. So they are both they're both voices of reason and protest in the play. And they can see through Richard's deception. They can see that he is wrong. No, not wrong. He is evil. He has his own agenda, and they often foreshadow the destruction that he will bring by calling him out. Like Margaret does that quite profusely. And so women here are highlighted as the voice of reason, and they're also the voice of morality and protest against Richard's immorality. So in scene 4, where Elizabeth, Margaret, and Duchess wail about how they've suffered at the hands of Richard, so it's in a way they come together to to kind of curse Richard, to kind of what's the word, to collectively mourn what Richard has done to them and to their families. So women are seen as voices of reason. But this is again one of the points where you can draw a comparison between Shakespeare and Pacino, because obviously Shakespeare marginalizes them because of his patriarchal theocratical context. Pacino also does the same thing. Even though Pacino made the documentary in his third wave feminist context, he had, like, he still gives no, like, there's no what's the word, there's no voice or power given to a lot of female characters. It's just mostly him, right? And we'll talk about this when we look at Pacino. But the play, I mean, in a big way, it's about Pacino. It's about Pacino's ego to control Shakespeare, that he doesn't think about a lot of these things, like these little things that yes, Shakespeare didn't show, but still Shakespeare showed them as voices of reason, where to a huge extent Pacino even takes that out. I've not, like, he shows Margaret's curse and stuff, but he doesn't dwell on it as much, and he doesn't show their significance as much either. Last recurring motif and theme that I want you to consider is that the play is full of dichotomies. So it's full of dichotomies that evoke dramatic tension through their sheer contrast. So good versus evil, vice versus virtue dichotomy. We see that throughout the play. The good the good Richmond versus the evil Richard. The wise Richard versus the virtuous Richmond. We see the heaven and hell dichotomy. We see appearance versus reality. That's obviously with Richard's facade, how he tries to, or not tries to, how he manipulates everyone. He's so duplicitous. He comes across as caring, understanding, kind, and he comes across as a supporter of the Yorks, supporter of King Edward and Queen Elizabeth and Clarence. However, no, he is not, right? That's his reality. And the Richard and Richmond dichotomy as well. And what you could also say is that Richmond, it's a form technique. Richmond is a foil to Richard's character. That's something to consider. That and Shakespeare uses like foil as a form, like as a technique a lot. So for example, with Macbeth, I think Banquo was a foil to Macbeth. The same way here, Richmond is a foil to Richard. So along with that, we obviously see it on a character level. So through characterization, Shakespeare uses dichotomies and antithesis, but we also see it on a more technical level with the language. So for example, these quotes, they all show the contrast there. They all show the dichotomies. So now is the winter of a discontent made glorious summer by the son of York. So this idea of winter of discontent for Richard versus the summer for the son of York. We also have seem a saint when most I play the devil, and that also links back to this heaven-hell dichotomy. Reap the harvest of perpetual peace by this one bloody trial of sharp war. So peace versus war. And also harvest versus the trial of war. And so these are some themes that you can look at for Richard III that overlap. They're pretty broad, but you can kind of try and sort of structure them in a way so that you can actually consider ideas so that your ideas are not repetitive. So these include ambition and determination, manipulation and deception, justice and order, determinism and humanism, and then the power of language. The power of language is a big one. That's basically looking at metatextuality. That's looking at how has Shakespeare used power how has Shakespeare used language in his play, and you can actually compare this quite nicely to Looking for Richard, because Shakespeare uses the power of language to basically manipulate the play, to show a play that is historically inaccurate, so that he can spread propaganda about and he can spread propaganda and he can legitimize the Tudor myth. Whereas Pacino also uses language to show a Shakespeare that's about his understanding of Shakespeare. That's one of the key things. Yes, he's like, oh, I want to show a Shakespeare that's about how we think and feel today. But Pacino also takes control of Shakespeare, and he does that through language, like changing that that G to a C prophecy, or even just generally the way in which he is in control all the time. So let's talk about that now. Other techniques include determinism and humanism, and justice and order. Um, Obviously, this will focus on this idea of fate versus free will. Now, remember though, one thing is important is that you need to be able to use these themes. Like, you want to use themes that you can talk about for both looking for Richard and Richard III. And that's why I would recommend, and myself, like for me, I always prefer to do an integrated essay, and I would recommend that you also try and write an integrated essay if you can, because that's an essay in which, in one body paragraph, you talk about both Richard and you talk about both Richard and looking for Richard, right? So that you can contrast. You can go, text one does this, text two does that. Text one does this, text two does that. So that it is a comparative study. It's true form. So next up, we have looking for Richard. Looking for Richard. Let's start with the context. Let's start with Pacino's personal context. So he is a well-established American actor. He is known for his dark anti-hero roles, like in The Godfather and Scarface. So he has this reputation, as an actor to play certain characters. That's the characters he excels with, right? So he doesn't play your rom-coms, romantic heroes or your sweet heroes. He usually plays dark characters who have a lot of nuance and complexity, like obviously Michael from Michael Corleone. So he's known for those characters, and that's why, in a way, you could think about why he specifically chose to do Richard III as a play. We'll talk about this idea, but think about that. Like, he's known for these roles. That's his personal context, right? You don't have to dwell too much into it, but what we really need to focus on is the social context, the social and the cultural context at the time. So the docudrama was created in 20th century America, so just at the dawn of the 21st century, 1996, and it focuses a lot, or it really brings to light the American dreams, the value of the Declaration of Independence, freedom of speech, egalitarianism. And we see this with the way in which he portrays Richard, right? And the way in which he portrays specifically Richard's downfall. So when Richard when he's starting to lose support, the way Pacino describes it is that now he's starting to lose support. People are unhappy, and when people are unhappy, they will do something about it. And then he shows people protesting. He shows people, and then he shows people protesting. And I think that's like close to like elections and stuff in the scene. So that, in a way, protesting and campaigning specifically. So that kind of shows you the way in which he is viewing this. He links Pacino, so he links Richard back to his context. He manipulates that. He says that, it's because people are not happy with Richard. And he takes that idea of whole, like fate versus free will, the humanist versus determinism struggle that Shakespeare shows. Pacino takes all of that away. And we'll talk more about this, but and so that links back to his American context. Same thing with postmodernism, so this rejection of absolute truth. So Pacino uses the nuanced hyper docudrama form and subjective analysis to reject absolute truths. That's why he, for example, after he interviews a scholar, he doesn't always agree with their analysis. He always goes, but what if? This is what I think, right? So there's that rejection of absolute truth. He's saying there's not only just one way in which you can actually interpret Shakespeare. And of course, it's a democratic, secular American society, and that is very different, and those values are very different to Shakespeare's Elizabethan theocratic society, right? So a society where they had a monarchy, they had a monarch. It's a theocratic society. People believed in God. So the way in which those ideas are portrayed across by Pacino are quite different. And then finally, 20th century feminism. Now, Pacino doesn't dwell on that much. He does not display the attitudes. He marginalizes the strong female characters, and also silences the female actors in the docudrama as well. So let's have a talk about his purpose, right? He says he wants to make Shakespeare inaccessible to his audience. He wants to portray a Shakespeare that is about how we think and feel today. However, is it really simply that, right? And this is something that I would say now, teaching tutoring uh Pacino and looking for Pacino and Richard now for 3 years now. This is something that I've also developed my understanding on now, and not during my Monet essay. So so that's why I kind of want to focus on this idea. It's that it's not just simply him making Shakespeare accessible to his audience. There's a purpose behind it, and that purpose is he wants to make a Shakespeare that's about him. He wants to show that this is how he thinks of Shakespeare, and that's the understanding he wants to feed his audience. And then that brings us to the question, why Richard III specifically? There are so many plays, so many other Shakespearean plays that are more popular. Why has he chosen Richard III? Firstly, the dark villainous character. The main hero, he is dark, he is villainous, he has his own agenda, his own motives, he's very cunning and conniving. And that's Pacino's, and that fits the bill for the characters that Pacino usually plays. And that's probably a character that Pacino can play well, that he understands that sort of psyche, so he's like, okay, I can take this on. Could you imagine Pacino as, for example, Romeo? um or even Hamlet to some extent, I think, because Hamlet was different. I think Hamlet was more irrational and passionate than evil, whereas Richard is evil. He is evil to the core. That's what Pacino is talking about. And the way Pacino describes it is quite interesting. Is that he says, like, for example, when he talks about Richard's deformity, he goes, his physical hunchback is like a manifestation of his psychological deformity. Like, it's not a physical thing, it's psychological. And can you see how that differs to how Shakespeare portrays it? Shakespeare, here's a Levitical doctrine. Shakespeare saying that, he's evil by nature. That's just who he is. He's evil. He was, and in the soliloquy, he was, the way he sort of mentions it is that he was unfinished, sent before his time, by deceiving nature, right? That's how Shakespeare paints it. Whereas Pacino's like, no, this is a psychological issue that he has. That's why he's physically like that. And you can see the clear distinction between the two values. Pacino's audience, his 20th century democratic, secular, more than anything else, his secular audience is going to understand that this is a psychological issue. This has nothing to do with nature. This has nothing to do with the way he has been born. It's a psychological thing. It's probably the way he's been treated by people, the way he looks at the world. It's a psychological thing. It's in his thinking. He probably thinks he's a victim of people judging him, whatever, and then he chooses to take revenge against that and become the villain, because he will never be accepted as a lover. Whereas with Richard III, he goes, nope, this guy is evil by nature. Shakespeare saying he's evil. That's nature's sign that this person is not to be trusted. He's not your hero. He's bad news. So you can see how the way in which the portrayal differs links back to their context. So that is that. The next thing is the text is relatively unknown. There probably would be other staged adaptations and stuff, but it's a pretty unknown text. It's not you probably would have obviously heard of Romeo and Juliet. Everyone's, I think, heard of Romeo and Juliet, I would say. Even Macbeth is super famous. Hamlet's famous, right? But Richard III, it's not a text that you would have known of. Before that, we know Shakespeare, but Richard III wouldn't be one of those plays. And so what Pacino does is he takes this relatively unknown play so that he can go, okay, this is my interpretation of it, because it hasn't been done before. So he has a lot of creative liberty and authority over the text that he wouldn't have had with like other plays that have had adaptations, like Romeo and Juliet. So many movies made, so many plays, and different novel adaptations made. Same thing with Hamlet. With that, he's more constrained in like the comparisons it would draw with other texts and the comparisons it would lead to. Whereas with Richard III, it's like he's going to be the main guy known for it. And he also challenges British hegemony over the text. And what that basically means is Shakespeare's obviously known as like Shakespearean discourse has British roots, right? That's basically it has British roots, and the only reason it's really studied is because it's Shakespeare, because it's like a literary thing, right? It's studied obviously here in Australia. It's studied, I think, in America as well. Yeah, I'd say so. And so what he does is that he wants to take that away. He doesn't want it to be like, oh, only a thing, or only a play that, or only a thing or a piece of work that the British people can relate to. He wants to make it accessible to his American audience. He wants to show its value to his American audience. That's why he didn't just make a film on it where he just acted the whole thing out. He made a docudrama. He wanted to break Richard down. He wanted to make it super simple for his audience. He wanted to, interview people, right? Can you imagine Al Pacino on the streets holding a mic and being like, so what do you think of Shakespeare? But he wanted to do that because he wanted to show that, this is a Shakespeare. Like, he wanted to show that we don't really think about it, we don't really care about it, but we should care about it. And this is exactly why. I'm going to show you why. I'm going to break it down. I'm going to show you the universal values that the text has, how it relates to us, how it relates to our thinking, and how Shakespeare, crafted it 400 years ago, but it's still relevant to us today. That's what Pacino is trying to do. And so the themes of play could be reflected in his society. He deconstructs it to make it relevant to society. So he takes out a lot of that stuff on determinism and humanism that Shakespeare had. Shakespeare had the Levitical doctrine. He was like, no, Richard's bad by nature because God made him bad. But Pacino's like, no, he's psychologically, he has a psychological illness. That's why he's physically deformed. Similarly with, like, for example, the whole Richard versus Richmond thing, right? At the end we see Richmond being a focus of the play. We see him being portrayed in a really good light from the beginning of the play. But with Al Pacino, we don't really see that. We just barely hear about Richmond towards the end, right? He introduces him quickly. That's another technique, do ex machina. He introduces him quickly, and then he's like, well, Richmond is making an army. He's gonna fight Richard. And even the last couple of scenes, like, there's not much significance given to Richmond at all. Similarly with the dream, with the ghost sequence, obviously it's a very important sequence in the play because it's a dream and the ghosts actually come and talk to him. In the docudrama, it's just a series of cuts, like it's a flashback. It's not even a dream, they're not even ghosts, right? It's just Richard like having flashbacks, thinking about what he's done. So different. Same thing with the end scene. When Shakespeare, Richmond kills Richard. He kills Richard. With Looking for Richard, what we see is that it's not Richmond killing Richard. It's actually one of the soldiers who shoot the arrow that gets Richard. So it's very, very different. It's very different, and it's because, and you could say that a soldier killing Richard in Pacino's work, instead of Richmond actually killing Richard, kind of links back to the democratic society, kind of links back to the democratic context. So it's not a ruler versus a ruler, it's the people. It's a lowly soldier killing the king, killing Richard. So there's a big difference in that. And so that's in terms of Pacino's purpose, how he makes it relevant to his society. Why a docudrama form? Why not a film? We've kind of touched upon this. We've kind of talked about why he specifically goes for that. But remember, he uses a docudrama form, not a film and not a novel. He wouldn't write a novel. I mean, you never can assume, because he could if he wanted to. He's Al Pacino, but that's not his forte. Okay, so why not just a simple film where he acts out the whole play? Because he wants to reach a wider audience. Because in a film, he he would just act out the play. He would talk in Shakespearean old, like he would just act out the play. He would be talking in the in iambic pentameter. He'd be following the lines of the play, and it probably wouldn't be watched by a lot of people, because who would go out to watch a Shakespearean film, right? Unless it's something, again, like culturally like adapted, like Romeo and Juliet or whatever, where it's like, oh, people want to go watch. Who would just want to watch Richard III, right? Especially if it's just a recount of what happened. So instead, he makes a docudrama form, this hybrid form where he's not just acting it out, but he's actually explaining his process. He uses all these different techniques, the method acting, the pastiche, the vox pops, all of that, to actually make it I guess an engaging experience for the audience, to be like, why don't you get involved in this, so that they actually can get involved in it. He breaks the fourth wall all the time. He's not pretending that there's no camera in front of him and it's real life. He's looking at the camera. He's like, this is um this is what Shakespeare's trying to do. This is what I think Shakespeare's wanting to say. This is what I think Richard is thinking at the moment. So it's a very, in a way, it's a very raw process of just being like, of breaking that fourth wall and talking to us directly. He uses technological advancements available to him, like lighting, camera angles, the montage scenes, to further highlight that theatricality of his work. So it's not just a simple film. He uses all of these techniques to make it more interesting, to make it more impactful. Like, he uses non-diegetic sound. Obviously Shakespeare didn't have access to any of that, so his work was pretty plain and simple. Just, actors delivering their lines, whereas here they have all these different ways in which he can emphasize and highlight certain things. And the key here is that the form also allows Shakespeare to assert his own authority over Shakespearean literature. One of the lines he says is, I know whatever I'm thinking, Shakespeare's thinking. And that's his ego as a composer speaking, right? How could you be so sure that whatever he's thinking, Shakespeare's thinking? Like, I truly doubt that whatever he's thinking, Shakespeare's not thinking. And you would think that after we've done this whole study, that Shakespeare's not thinking about Richard being psychologically not well. Shakespeare's thinking that Richard's going against God. Shakespeare's thinking that Richard's going against the monarch, going against the king, and he's going to suffer for it. That's what Shakespeare's thinking. That's probably what he's thinking, right? I can't claim to say whatever I'm thinking Shakespeare's thinking either, but we can tell that Pacino takes a lot of control over Shakespearean literature. He emphasizes his and his cast reputation, and he also practices method acting through it, right? He tries to take form of Richard, to try and think like Richard, to try and act like Richard. And so the film can be considered a mosaic. So that's basically this combination, this element of the vox pops, the play enactments, the cuts between the different scholars, and the documentary style explanation. And they all lend themselves to Pacino's cinema verite form. And that's his intention, to convey holistic ideas, not just to convey, like his and that's the thing, like, it's not just his interpretation. He also does show people on the streets. He also does show scholars and what they but what he does do is that he kind of goes, this is what the scholars say. They're probably, like, they're complicating it. This is what I think. He does do that as well, on the other hand. Film techniques, really important. Form is so important here, and this is how you will be linking back the discussion between the two texts. So let's have a look at some things that you can talk about. So there's cinema variety, which is standing for truthful cinema. Cinema. What am I saying? Okay, so it stands for truthful cinema, right? And that's the fact that Pacino's work uses these techniques to create a heavily constructed cinema verite, which is that it combines these staccato cuts between the directors, not cuts, not cutes, between the directors, between scholarly interviews, vox pops, and the costume versions of the play, like the actual enactments. That's putting this whole this mosaic of these different elements together. There's also avant-garde, which is when there are quick cuts between different locations. So one moment he's just in a studio, the other moment he's out on the street, another moment he's in the car. At the moment, he is, in the Globe Theatre, or he's in some fancy building, right? So he uses this to demythologize the Shakespearean literature, to show that it's all happening in one place, or, to show that location is relevant. That's what he's doing. He's saying that the location is not relevant. It's the ideas, right? It's the ideas. What's actually happening that's relevant. Location doesn't matter. And that again plays into his bigger purpose, his bigger idea of subverting the idea that Shakespeare only belongs to the British, or Shakespeare is a British entity. He's taking that away. He's saying location doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter if you look at Shakespeare in England, in America, in Australia, it's Shakespeare. He's universal. Then we have method acting, so that's Pacino's characterization of Richard, and that relies on the knowledge that, like Pacino, Richard is an actor, and that's why, again, you can say that Pacino dons on Richard's hat so well. It's because Pacino knows that Richard is an actor, that he's acting, it's all bluff. He's not actually, like, the Anne scene, right? The wooing of Anne scene, you could clearly see how he breaks it down for the audience first. He's like, this guy's an actor. He is going to he's going to get Anne to fall into his trap, right? He's going to get Anne to fall into his trap. So he's an actor, and he relies on Richard's acting to portray Richard. And so the docudrama heavily relies on Pacino's method acting. And his method acting to actually superimpose himself as both the character and the actor. Like, he's both. He's the actor in the play, but he's the character, he's the director, he's the composer, he's everything. And then the intercuts. So, just a note, so when we talk about him being an actor, director, the composer, again, talk about his authorial purpose, talk about the power of his language, the power he has over the play, the same way, and that's a resonance, right, between Shakespeare and Richard, the same way Shakespeare and Pacino, the same way Shakespeare has that power over the play to portray to us a historically inaccurate play. Pacino has the power to choose to put in whatever he wants to show us, and so that's his power as a character and an actor. There are intercuts to impose his own translation over the play. He's manipulated interviews, for example, right? He tries to assert his own opinions in one way or another, to be like, oh, that's what the scholar's saying. Nah. He curses them. He's like, nah, yeah, whatever. This is what I think. This is how I think we should do it. Or when he, for example, changes that line from Shakespeare, he's like, G of Edward's heir, Edward's heir, the killer Sharpie. He's like, G, I think we should put in a C instead. And that is obviously quite interesting, because he's just changed the line of a Shakespearean play like it's nothing. And so he has a lot of power and manipulation. Like, he manipulates language a lot. Another thing to talk about are the vox pops. So those are the street interviews, which are part of the pastiche form. You can also talk about casting. We can talk about, for example, flashbacks. Like, Margaret's curse is showed in, like, later scenes where they flash back to Margaret's curses. Sorry about the spelling mistake there. Okay. Allergies, sorry. So, how do you compare the two texts? Biggest thing is context. How are they showing, how are they linking back to their context, right? So think about, and I'm going to try to write, so think about Shakespeare, think about Pacino, right? Shakespeare's Elizabethan context. So Elizabethan, providentialist, theocratic, determinism. Whereas Pacino, 20th century America, right? So that changes. That's why he takes so much stuff away, because he wants to make it super simple for his audience. It's a postmodernist society, rejection of absolute truths. It's also a secular democratic society. So that's quite important, because that's why he takes away all the religious meaning from Shakespeare's work. The whole argument about determinism and fate versus free will, he takes all of that away to be like, it's psychological, to have a psychoanalysis almost of Richard's character. The same way with democratic, he takes away the whole, idea of Richard versus Richmond, which was the whole key behind Shakespeare's play. Instead, he is like, like he's more like Richard was. He got there, he was evil, he got there, and then he wasn't able to keep his throne. People weren't happy with him. That led to his downfall. That's why he loses, because he's like, if because in a way he's kind of saying, and he doesn't say it explicitly, but you can imagine he's basically in a way saying that if people were happy with him, if he was actually a good king, Richmond wouldn't have come with his army and he wouldn't have lost. Like, Richard would have been more supported, but what Richard has done is he's cut off all his connections. He has gone against everyone who's helped him, and now he's going to have a downfall because of that. Then, authorial purpose, Shakespeare's propaganda, pleasing Queen Elizabeth I, legitimizing the Tudor myth, whereas Pacino taking control over the Shakespearean narrative, portraying a Shakespeare that's relevant to his American audience. Think about values, kind of links back to context. Form is a big one. Shakespearean dramas, soliloquies, asides, characterization, stage directions versus docudrama. All the things we talked about. Method acting, avant-garde, cinema verite, method acting, all of those things. Make sure you use those in your essays. And then language, the power of language. Okay, so some key seeds to analyze. If you're looking for specific key seeds to analyze across your text, here are some. So I've already talked about Pacino changing the G of Edward's heir to killer. Edward's heir, the killer shall be, to C of Edward's heir, the killer shall be. And we've obviously talked about why he did that, how it, it's quite ironic because it just takes away meaning from what Shakespeare was trying to get at in the first place. And then Richard's physiognomy. So Shakespeare adheres to the Levitical doctrine. He's like, this person, like, he's basically showing Richard is evil by nature, and Richard affirms that in his soliloquy. He's like, unfinished, sent before my time by dissembling nature. He says it. Whereas Pacino's like, he looks at it through a psychoanalytical lens. He reduces that to he takes away that significance, and he's like, no, this guy is, there's like psychoanalytically, like psychologically, he's not well. That's why it manifests physically in the form of the hunchback. The ghost scene, again, Shakespeare's portrayal of the ghost, like he shows the ghosts, each one of the ghosts speak to him. Buckingham, for example, when Buckingham says, God and good angels fight, and Richmond's side, Richard falls in the height of his own pride. That's pretty significant. What Pacino does is he just uses quick cutscenes to show a dream. He doesn't actually have a proper dream. It's just quick cutscenes, bit of flashback, and that's just showing. And that's, again, it's like Richard is like subconsciously, and again, that's like the psychological part of it. He's showing that Richard subconsciously knows he's done the wrong thing, so it's his subconscious taunting him, not like not ghosts and not dreams. And viewing scene, think about Pacino's explanation, and that's in fact, that's one place where you could think about a resonance between the two plays, how Shakespeare shows her as weak and as falling for Richard's trap, and the way in which Pacino explains that. He's like, I want someone young, someone who's going to fall for his rap, someone who is going to believe him. And then the way he explains it, he's like, she has no future, she has no husband, no protector, she has no future, right? So there's that resonance in the way they both marginalize Anne's character. However, Pacino explains it when he's breaking down the scene, that he wants, like, he's like, I want someone young, someone who's going to fall for his rap, right? So he's kind of like breaking that down. In a way, he's saying that's probably why Anne fell for Richard, is because she was young, she was naive. But then he obviously adds that bit about, she has no husband, no future, whatever, and that's kind of like resonating with what Shakespeare was trying to get at. And then Richard's death, again, the dramatic fight between Richmond and Richard versus Pacino's portrayal of a soldier killing Richard. Like, that takes away, again, meaning from Richmond altogether, and it again simplifies the last scene a lot. So, those are some key scenes to think about. There's so many throughout the play, but these are some of the ones I like. So, and I remember, so these are the ones I've popped in, but feel free to have a look at, obviously, any others that resonate with your understanding. So, now if you look at, let's break it down. So we're going to analyze these quotes, we're going to analyze a specific quote from Richard and looking for Richard, and we're going to do that with the theme of fate versus free will. So in Richard III, obviously the context is monarchic power, providentialism, Christian ideology, and intention with Renaissance humanism, the divine right of kings. So when we see now is the winter of discontent, we can obviously analyze it through those lenses. So how this subverts the conventions of tragedy by introducing main character first. That's quite important in all of Shakespeare's other play. It's usually some palace person or guard or just like a soldier, whatever, speaking to each other, or two messengers speaking to each other. That's quite common. Here Shakespeare goes straight into it. He just immediately gets into a soliloquy and goes, Richard is evil. So it subverts those conventions of the tragedy. The soliloquy, of course, is a key form feature. The commanding tone of voice, and the collective pronoun of "are." So it's basically trying to the collective pronoun of "are" is basically trying to, again, include the audience. So I'm just trying to get my charger. Okay, here we go. Okay, here we go. So this is that collective pronoun of "are." Whereas it's looking for Richard, where the context is democratic context, individualism and individual liberty, secularism, postmodernism. So this is where Pacino, when he says, "Who wants to say action? I don't want to." There's that first person pronoun. There's a Hollywood jargon, which implies the symbolic role of the director. There's a rhetorical question, and there is a melodramatic tone. Who wants to say action? I don't want to. And I'm pretty sure that in that scene, he's the one who ends up saying action anyway. So that's that. So then, if we get a bit meta and we look at the metatextual element of it, when he says, "I'm determined to prove a villain in Richard III," there's that past participle of determined. Richard has no control over his representations, right? The invocation of the stock characters, for example, the vice. He's a vice character. Shakespeare smooths history into tales of heroes and villains according to the Tudor myth. So there's no nuanced representation of it. There's no complexity showed. It's just villain versus hero. It's just good versus evil. Richmond is good, Richard is evil. That's what Shakespeare's showing. And so the free will of the composer is restrained. Think about it that way. Like the composer himself is restrained to show it in a certain way because that's what his context requires. Whereas with looking for Richard, and there's a quote, we could communicate a Shakespeare that is about how we think and feel today. And then the way in which they derogatory refer to scholars, as you can see in that quote there. So there's a vulgar epithet, a dismissive tone, and it's quite egocentric, right? There's that egocentrism. So there's a visual comedy of Shakespeare putting his head in his hands while Al Pacino puts on his plate. And that is a metaphor for Pacino's disregard almost of Shakespeare's work, of almost saying, this is the Shakespeare about how I think today. And that's where Pacino disregards Shakespeare's intent, all these things that were culturally relevant to Shakespeare. He disregards that, makes it about his audience, his culture, and his own preoccupation with, his role as an actor and a composer. So here, the free will of the composer is venerated. And you can see that quote there. He's like, he goes to Pacino, you know more about Richard III than any effing scholar. And that's Kimball kind of being being Pacino's Buckingham and saying, you know more than anyone else. You know more than any scholar who's read the play, who's a critic, who's studied the play in more detail than you have. So that shows you how the free will of the composer is venerated, how Pacino and his cronies take control of the play there. So, themes for analysis. How should you go about analyzing the play? So these are some themes: morality, deceit, gender, fate versus free will, performance. So with performance, you could talk about Richard's performance, you could talk about the performance he puts on. But another thing you could go metatextual, and you could actually talk about Shakespeare and Pacino's performances, the performance they put on, the acts they put on to achieve their authorial purpose. You could obviously talk about language. Language is a good one because that's, again, links back to metatextuality really well, and power. I would, like I said earlier, I would recommend an integrated structure for module A, just because I I would say that it is the best structure to do because it really allows you to go back and forth between the two texts. Pacino said this, Shakespeare's done this. Shakespeare said this, Pacino's reconstructed it in this way. Then Shakespeare's gone back, and then when I look back at Shakespeare, this is how he's shown this, whereas Pacino has shown this. There are these similarities, there are these differences between the two. So I think it really allows you to do that. You could obviously do a text by text approach where you've got the first paragraph on Shakespeare, second paragraph on Pacino, third paragraph on Shakespeare, fourth paragraph on Pacino. But the only thing with that is that a lot of your analysis is happening in that second paragraph for Pacino, where you're going, Pacino's done this, whereas Shakespeare did this, right? That's where the comparison occurs. The comparison wouldn't occur in the first paragraph, because in the first paragraph and in the third paragraph, you would just talk about Shakespeare's work. Then you would bring in the child text, the adapted text, in the second and the fourth paragraph, and that's where you would compare. So I think it kind of takes away that ability for you to compare throughout the essay. That's why I would say integrated essay is better, but it is a bit harder than a text by text approach, so you do have to practice it. For your essays, I would always recommend learn your quotes, memorize your quotes. Do not memorize your essays just because the question could be super specific, the question could be super generic, you don't know. It could just simply be about the reconstruction, dismantling of ideas, about the appropriation of the text, or it could be super specific about form and how form has allowed your study of textual conversation and change your understanding about a certain theme in the text, like power, right? So it can be super specific, super broad. So I would always recommend analyze your quotes, remember your quotes and your your analysis and your techniques and effects and stuff. Remember that. Take your analysis into the exam room with you. Obviously, memorizing your analysis, but like not memorizing your whole essay, because you want to adapt that. And how do you get good at that? You do practice questions. The way I would do it is like I would have a QTEL table. So once I've done my study, like I've got all my notes and everything, I would make a QTEL table where it's quote, technique, effect of the technique, and link, right? So quote, technique, effect of technique, and link. So 4 columns. I will pop my quotes, techniques, and effect and link in, and then that is what I would use for my revision. So then whenever I do a practice essay, I might start off with having that paper with me where I'm writing and I'm just looking at my quotes and techniques, and then slowly I would take that out and just try and write from what I remember. And that way, practicing essays and practicing manipulating essays is a really good way to go. Manipulating essays and practicing them, under timed conditions is good, because the essays can be pretty big for moderate. It could be a pretty long essay, so make sure you practice doing that under exam conditions. Tips for analysis. When it comes to analysis for your quotes, start with the easy techniques. Start with the easy techniques first, then try and find multiple techniques for your quotes. It just elevates your analysis. Be flexible about what the effect of that technique could be, because you can then change that based on the argument. You can then change that based on the question. So you want to choose quotes where you could be like, this means this, but in your head that this could also mean something else. In your essays, always use high modality language, and never say this may mean this. Always say this is what this means. Be super stubborn and super confident about your analysis. Look for implicit purpose behind the quote. Now, with your, for example, technique and effect of the quote and the purpose, don't make it generic. Don't just say hence the, like, for example, if you're saying the technique for power, if you've got a quote for a manipulation of power, you don't just want to say hence Shakespeare shows a manipulation of power. Be specific. What does he actually show by the manipulation of power? So be super implicit about the purpose behind the quotes. Read quotes against the grain. You don't have to agree with everything your teacher says. Be curious, question even the smallest language choices and why your composer has chosen to make them. What is the purpose behind it? And that is it for this lecture. So thank you so much for watching. Good luck with Module A, Module B, with all of HSC English. I will be live the next couple of minutes on the chat to answer any of your questions. So if you have any questions, please ask. But I hope you found this helpful. I hope this if you haven't started Richards yet, I hope this gave you a good head start. If you have started and you've done it this term, I hope this helped consolidate your notes and your knowledge. Thank you so much. Enjoy. Good luck for this term. Good luck for your trials next term. And I'm sure you guys will smash it. Take care.